Well, hello everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable educational trust called Common Knowledge. And today I'm continuing this You in Childbirth series. Today on, what am I on? 34 talks already. So you can find the playlist in our YouTube channel, Birthing Better One, and go through these. And I have to say that COVID has driven me into the public via the internet because of my 50 years of experience within the childbirth conversation that started off being frustrated in the 70s and has only grown to be more frustrated by the year 2020. That'll tell you something. So, why am I frustrated? Well, I'm a woman who's had children, and I'm a woman who's had children within the conversation of childbirth. It seems like it makes sense, our whole conversation. Somehow, childbirth, pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events. That seems to make sense. Yet, why doesn't it make sense? And if we just ended up with that statement, pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events, we wouldn't have a conflict about what the word normal means. But we attached that conversation to modern medicine and things like hospitals versus home births, or obstetricians versus midwives, or natural versus medical births. And you can see how the conversation breaks down because underlying all of that are simple truths, which is women are either pregnant or not. And when we're pregnant around the globe throughout time, we have to give birth one way or another. And it's an activity that each of us does with our baby alone, no matter where we birth or who's present or any of our circumstances. So we have these global truths, and then we have this modern conversation. And this conversation actually became global in the 1980s. It wasn't global when I gave birth in 1970. It was countrywide, and sometimes, because I gave birth in the US, statewide. So one of the things that changed in my lifetime was one is the evidence-based maternity system, which is now in its third iteration, and the other is the conversation around childbirth. So when I gave birth in 1970, there wasn't much of a conversation, but it was beginning to, because the first ever childbirth preparation classes were being taught. And those were entirely skills-based. In New Zealand, they were Grantley Dick Reed, or Childbirth Without Fear. And if you want to understand how that childbirth without fear is actually an inaccurate information, go back to the second video that I did in this series that talks about the gift of fear. That fear isn't something that should be avoided in pregnancy. It should be developed as an observational tool. And Lamaze and Bradley method. Fathers were just coming in. Bradley was called husband-based childbirth. So in fact, we had this experience when childbirth was having a profound change, as it had after the Second World War, where women started to go into hospitals and where modern medicine became much more sophisticated. And from the 70s to the 80s, as this global conversation of childbirth began to develop, there was a concept within the natural birth movement about what an ideal maternity system would look like. And that ideal maternity system, with the exception of one incredibly significant omission, is in New Zealand, where our trust is. So what everybody has wanted since the 70s has been a midwifery-led maternity system. The belief behind that is that women have always given births with midwives. That's not accurate, but let's just assume that it has some vague accuracy, which it does. However, around the world, in cultures around the world, it was usually your aunt or your mother-in-law, your grandmother, or everybody, or in some cultures, you went off by yourself. So even the conversation about the role of midwifery has been a conversation that hasn't been accurate. In India, the midwives came from the untouchable caste because they could handle human waste products. So they weren't highly respected. Western belief was that midwives were burned as witches. Well, maybe they were somewhere, but normally it was just your aunt or your mother or your grandmother or your mother-in-law. They weren't a midwife. They weren't going to attend other births. There were some cultures where there was somebody who did attend births as a midwife, and particularly as industrialization occurred and cities grew up, then there were more women who did that. And so we've had this evolution. Women have always given birth, and we've had this evolution of what is the best care that goes with pregnancy and childbirth. And so in the 70s and 80s, the conversation started to exist, which was, well, what's an ideal maternity system look like? And for the natural birth movement, it was a midwifery-led model, and that was put in place in New Zealand in 1990. And it was that midwives weren't trained as nurses. They were considered, if they were nurse midwives, to be midwives. They couldn't be real midwives, which is where we go really crazy, isn't it? That's sort of like a crazy conversation. But in New Zealand, they're direct entry. They're not nurses, which ultimately means that midwives who are focused on pregnancy and birth often aren't integrating the health issues that the mother or the baby actually has. So there's a disadvantage of having people only focused on this narrow part of someone's life, but that's okay. So when the natural birth movement envisioned this maternity system that was led by midwives, direct entry midwives, they envisioned a system that would have continuity of care. Now, because I've been involved in the childbirth conversation for 50 years and have talked to tens and thousands of women worldwide, everyone would like the same person to see them in pregnancy and be at their birth. Everybody would really like that, ideally. They don't really care who's with them after the birth. They would really like somebody to clean and shop and take care of the other kids and cook. They don't really care whether it's the person who saw them in pregnancy and birth. But in New Zealand, they put in a continuity of care model, which was that the midwife saw a woman in pregnancy, birth, and postnatally for 6 weeks. So the natural birth movement that wanted all these things, New Zealand has elevated it. It's free to the consumer. The midwifery profession is an autonomous profession. That means it's beholden to themselves. They get to set up education. They get to do the evaluations and set up standards of care and criteria of practice. They also give every midwife the right to have an autonomous practice, which is both good and bad, because if you have an autonomous practice, you're not paying attention to the bigger issue around childbirth within your country. You're only focused on your narrow practice and your narrow clients. And another thing that the natural birth movement wanted was that women be in partnership with their care providers. So New Zealand put that in place. There's a partnership model. So you have a partnership. So partnership should be, ideally, I think we can agree on this, one partner has skills for their task or their role or their job, and the other partner has skills for their tasks or their role or their job. And this is where the New Zealand partnership model and the perception that came out of the natural birth movement just falls apart. The natural birth movement has a strong belief that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events. We can all agree on that. We can absolutely all agree on that. That's true. Take away medical care, women get pregnant, women give birth, one way or the other. We can all agree on that. However, that statement then is followed by an inaccurate statement, which is pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. That's inaccurate isn't the right word, maybe misleading, definitely the right word. So if we take 1,000 women who are of childbearing age but are not pregnant, easily 80% or more around the world will have one or more health issue. They may not be life threatening, but they're a health issue. And if they live in a modern country, most of those people will have sought or be under medical care before they get pregnant. So life is normal, natural, and yet we have health issues, and we can have financial issues. We can have substance abuse issues. We could have physical abuse in our home. We could be living in a war or in poverty. So, unpregnant, childbearing women can have lots of issues, health issues, financial issues, personal issues, emotional issues. So then this whole group gets pregnant. Some of those issues can just dissipate, and others get worse, and new ones come along. And now you can have issues with the baby as well. So, this idea that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care is very misleading. And that leads us to misleading assumptions. So then, if all those 1,000 women who are of childbearing age and not pregnant, bringing in issues, and then they got pregnant and issues changed or morphed, then you put them into birth, they also can have issues, either stemming from pre-pregnancy or arising only in birth for both the mother and the baby. So when we just blithely say pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care, we're misleading each other as women. And that becomes problematic and is part of this issue of continuity of care, and particularly within the partnership. So continuity of care is basically having the same care provider. It could be a GP, it could be a midwife, it could be an obstetrician. Right? And in fact, we somewhat have that in a lot of countries, although sometimes we call it a team. So we don't specifically have one person who's continuity of care. In New Zealand, they try to have one person, which then loads that one person up with the need to make a living, depending on how they're paid. So in New Zealand, if you work for a district health board within this midwifery model of care, you're paid by the government through the district health board, and you have benefits to do that. You can have your own clients, and you do work in a team, and you get a car, and you get petrol, and you get your equipment paid for as part of your occupational salaries. They also have community midwives or independent midwives that in New Zealand are considered to be the real midwife because they do home births and they work independently and they provide continuity of care pretty much on a one-to-one basis, although because of this enormous failure within the New Zealand midwifery model, they're now more and more having teams because they're tired. The women who work as midwives are tired. They get paid by the government, but they get paid in pieces parts. So they have to do between 25 and 60 births a year in continuity of care, seeing every woman in pregnancy, being at every birth when the woman wants her to be, so she can be at a birth for 36 or 48 hours without any respite, although that's getting rarer and rarer because now they're working as a team, and it's stupid, honestly. And so you have then midwives who are also giving postnatal care. And we have a natural birth movement that since the 70s, that predates the midwifery model of care in New Zealand, was this concept that midwives, and this was another inaccurate concept, that midwives were all things to a pregnant woman, that she didn't just deal with the birth, that she dealt with a woman's emotional state and blah, 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 blah. This is too much. It's just too much. So when we think about continuity of care, we as women who are pregnant need to think about the lives of the care providers who are giving us continuity of care. We need to have an obligation to our birth providers that we do not exhaust them. It's just going to make having these goals impossible to, to maintain over a period of time when we as consumers exhaust our maternity providers. And we do that because of this omission that occurred within this concept of continuity of care, and particularly the partnership model. But this omission has been pervasive in the childbirth conversation since the 80s. Because, as I mentioned earlier, in the 70s, particularly in the United States, the first childbirth preparation classes were taught, and they were all skills based. That meant throughout time, throughout place, where women lacked skills, they lacked skills. We know this because it was common to say women suffered in childbirth. And the suffering in childbirth was not related to a tragic outcome. It was related to the fact that labor pains, the normal and natural labor pains, hurt. We can't control them. It's hard to stay on top of it. And when we lack skills that do not adjust, do not adapt, and aren't sustainable, we feel overwhelmed. And then we feel we've suffered in childbirth. That is a word that is known worldwide. And it was accepted because there was no skills attached to giving birth. How do I know that? Because I've spent a lot of time in and around traditional communities where there is no medical care, not involved with birth, but certainly talking to people about birth. And so I know from experience in 20 to 30 cultures that skills that we use as women to birth our baby don't exist. And the concept in the 70s that there were a set of skills was very tantalizing. Sadly, Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed were focused on low-risk women. So that was a profound mistake. They didn't focus on 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, and 100% can have skills. And when 100% of pregnant women use skills, we can reduce the suffering in childbirth tremendously, which is in fact what obstetricians and labor and delivery nurses saw for a generation from the 60s to the 70s. We didn't suffer as much, but that hadn't been the goal. The goal was for low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions, and not enough women achieved that. So the original mistake was, the original good thing was that skills were finally being looked at as something we could all use. The mistake was that they were focused on only this low-risk women rather than 100% of us. And the other mistake was they were focused on achieving a type of birth rather than on the reduction of suffering across the board, which then might have changed how women birthed over time. Because if that had carried on as a societal message, then my generation of women would have said to their sons and daughters, it's normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, and then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. And my son and daughter would have said that to their son and daughter. And that didn't happen because the natural birth movement in the early 1980s was continued to stay focused on low-risk women and achieving a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical intervention. And they wanted to give those women a continuity of care partnership model. New Zealand went further than that, which is wonderful. They gave a continuity of care partnership model to everyone since 1990. This is absolutely remarkable, whether you're high risk or low risk. Every woman, every family in New Zealand has a continuity of care midwife who has a partnership model. So, what's the problem? The problem is the partnership. So, we've talked about continuity of care and how that can exhaust midwives. And if we look at the New Zealand midwifery model, we can even understand that further. Because when midwives were seeking to be an independent practice and not be nurse midwives, the nursing profession wanted midwifery to be a post nursing degree. And natural birth advocates, the home birth midwives, wanted midwifery to be a specialty, just about midwives, not an integration within the medical model, because they considered that, as I said, to be midwifery, not midwifery, and that the real midwives were not medically trained and that they did home births. They were community midwives. So the activists in the midwifery movement had to separate themselves, find a logic to separate themselves from the nursing profession. And they, excuse me, focused on that midwives worked in shifts, nurses worked in shifts, and that midwives decided within their new model that they would give women 24/7 care. Now, how does that line up with a professional belief that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care? Where does giving a woman 24/7 care in a continuity of care model line up with that belief that pregnancy and childbirth are basically nothing burgers? It doesn't. But what it does is it exhausts the women who work as midwives, because when you give your clients 24/7 access to you in continuity of care, they use that with total disregard to the fact that you have other clients and a family in your own life. So since 1990, this is what New Zealand midwives have done. And they're absolutely exhausted. And they don't tend to stay in the profession as an independent midwife or community midwife throughout their life. It's just exhausting. So they also in New Zealand, and this was wanted in the natural birth movement in the late 70s and 80s, to have this partnership. They wanted women to be engaged in decision making. The way that it was explained to us as women is that each of us knows what kind of birth we want. And so we should just be able to articulate to our birth professionals what we want. We should learn the pros and cons of medical care, which were now called interventions, with the implication that interventions were imposed on women and unnecessary because low-risk women shouldn't have to have these assessments, monitoring procedures, and everybody was having them. And so they were unnecessary and imposed on people, and that low-risk women should be able to make a birth plan that says to the care provider, the midwife or the obstetrician or the general practice doctor, this is what I want, and this is what I expect you to give me. So in that partnership model, the woman becomes a stronger partner, rightly so, because the care providers are highly skilled, rightly so, because they're there to safeguard the health and well-being of the baby. And that means that it's very easy to have a system that I gave birth in first, which is called follow your doctor's orders. Very easy to do that. No choices. So choices are good. However, choices have a downside, don't they? Because ultimately, we really don't know. There's some global truths. There's no way to know what your birth's going to be like, and babies don't come to plan, which means we may know what kind of birth we want, and that may have nothing to do with the kind of birth that we actually have. And in reality, when I've spoken to tens and thousands of women, not many had the birth they actually envisioned. And the rest of us had births that were unlike anything that we imagined. So we're planning for a birth that doesn't unfold the way that we want. And then in the throes of birth, we are expected somehow in this partnership model to be able to make informed consent decisions. How can we best do that? And that's the question. Well, there was a skill-based trend in the 60s and the 70s. That got dismantled by this global natural birth movement, with very famous authors basically saying, skills do not work to achieve these goals. Low-risk women using skills don't necessarily achieve these goals of natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care. So, really, the issue is that they just need to choose the birth that they want, and then they'll achieve those goals. And that skills are dismissed because pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events, which means that they're physiological, and because you're pregnant, you will give birth one way or another. In fact, I gave birth where there was only a 4.5% cesarean rate. So all of us labored. Whether we suffered or not, whether we had a short labor, we labored for days, whether we had a good outcome or we had a tragedy, whether we had risks or not. Risks were considered to be normal and natural. And the risks that ended up in problems were considered to be normal and natural. Tragedies were considered to be normal and natural because I gave birth on the cusp of effective birth control. So women were just expected to have more children if there was a tragedy. Very similar to immunizations, really, because if you go around the cemeteries around the world, 20 to 30% of children prior to immunizations and antibiotics died before the age of 5 from infectious diseases. We forget that. It's normal and natural that you have problems in life. Some people die. It's a tragedy. So when the partnership model was developed, the idea was a good idea that women should be involved in their care. It's a good idea. But the application of it is unworkable. And the part of why it's unworkable, because we have New Zealand to look at, and it's a loved maternity system. I've been in New Zealand since the 90s, absolutely love it. And our trust has tried since the 90s to explain to midwives that if you have a partnership model based on pregnancy and childbirth or normal life events that rarely require medical care, then you need to assess what that partnership model means. Why, for example, do you as midwives need to go to school for 4 years if you consider pregnancy and childbirth normal life events? Why do you need to go to school at all, but much less for 4 years? And midwives and consumers would answer, just in case, right? So because we do assessments and monitoring and some procedures, we're doing that to safeguard the health and well-being of the mother and baby. Because even though pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care, that's actually really not accurate. Is that there are lots of issues in modern societies that assessing within the medical model, monitoring the medical model, and doing procedures in the medical model during pregnancy and birth are actually safeguarding the health and well-being of the mother and baby. And yes, definitely there's overkill, but we can't assume that a woman who's healthy has a healthy baby or is going to have a simple birth, nor can we assume that a woman who has multiple risks is going to have a complicated birth or a poor outcome. We just don't know. We know after the fact. And this is where the medical profession says birth is safe afterwards. And the midwifery, the natural birth movement, says birth is safe unless proven otherwise. So both are accurate and both are functional. And so we have to then ask, if we know that why doctors and obstetricians go to school, because they're dealing with high-risk women and they're using assessments, monitoring procedures, and those bleed over into the rest of us. The midwifery model is a belief that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events and that women know how to birth, that we've always birthed. And if we're just left alone to discover birth and just left alone, fathers no longer coach as they did in the 60s and 70s, They just support women's choices. Women don't need skills because cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women just know how to birth, and they just need to have midwives sit in the corner and knit, or obstetricians leave them alone to discover birth by themselves. And that this is somehow a partnership, and that the partnership is based on highly skilled professionals. And so let's take the obstetricians out of there, because in New Zealand you still have continuity of care. Even if you're recommended to an obstetrician, you still have your lead maternity care, your midwife. And your role, us as pregnant women in this partnership model in New Zealand, is that we can just make choices. That we just say to the midwife, this is what I want, this is what I don't want, and you're going to give that to me, right? Because I know what kind of birth I want. You're telling me that I know what kind of birth I want. I should just make choices. You support this partnership model. You support informed consent. You support my choices and my birth plans. And so therefore I'm relying on you to give me the birth I want. And that's exhausting. And that's a weak partnership. Because a partnership we discussed has to be based on skills for the task and the role in the job, and skills for the task and the role in the job. We had a moment in the 60s and 70s when almost we could say skills for 100% of pregnant women, skills to reduce suffering. Almost didn't. Mistake. We could have, the natural birth movement in the 80s had said, at least skills and choices go together. We're sitting on the fence about skills, but we've seen a lot of women use them very effectively, so let's have skills and choices go together. But they didn't. They dismissed skills. So we're now, and then COVID came along. So our trust is out here now saying to people, because our trust holds a concept developed by fathers and mothers in the 70s, and that concept was that when you're pregnant, it's normal and natural, self-learned birth and birth coaching skills, and use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. Whatever birth you have, it's your baby's birth. So it's an activity. So use the skills. And our trust also holds all the skills that fathers and mothers developed. And so we tried as a trust to say to the New Zealand midwives, you will have the most phenomenal system in the world when you balance this partnership. First of all, less than 10% of midwives in New Zealand explain the partnership, and yet that's the rock bottom foundation of what midwives are doing. They have a partnership and continuity of care based on pregnancy and childbirth or normal life events that rarely require medical care. So we have tried to say to New Zealand midwives, you as midwives just simply need to say to your clients, and anybody who's listening to this, a birth professional, adapt this to your clientele. It's just very simple to say, we're going to respect your choices as much as possible. We're going to involve you in, your care through informed consent. But it's an activity you're going to have to do. And then hopefully give them a handout of different skills-based methods, not information-based methods, skills-based methods. Birthing better, what our trust holds is one of them. Hypnobirthing, hypnobabies, calm birth, birthing within, Lamaze, Bradley, Grantley, Dick Reed. There are a bunch of skills-based methods. Just give them a handout and say at 24 weeks, start to tell me what skills you're learning, and we're going to just put those in your notes along with your lab tests, your questions, your choices. We're going to load your notes with your skills. I don't need to know them as a care provider. You just need to know if you've learned breathing, relaxation, if you've done the internal work, if you know how to create space in your pelvis. Great, you know them. We'll just put those in your notes. And then as your birth unfolds, if you are coping well and managing well and working with your partner well, we're going to praise you because we love, as birth professionals, working with skilled families. If you look like you're overwhelmed, any of us can look through your notes and see you've learned some skills, and we can encourage you to use them. That's what our trust invited New Zealand midwives to do. And none of them participated in our offer. And that was a number of years ago. And so here I am today. COVID's arrived, And I'm talking about continuity of care and a midwifery partnership. If you, as a pregnant woman, believe that you're in partnership with your birth professional, in which you are with all of them, from the staunchest OB to the most liberal midwife to your doula, you are in partnership with them, not because they have given you permission to, not because they have identified that, but because you are engaged with them. That means we, as expectant parents, can say, yeah, normal and natural when I'm pregnant to self-learn skills, and I'm going to tell my birth professional from 24 weeks onward and every appointment after that what skill I've learned. I don't care if they know them or not. I just want them in my notes so that when I am giving birth and they are present, I want them to see me coping well, managing well, working through the activity I'm doing, handling this well, staying on top of it and feeling in control while I work through this activity of birthing my baby. And hopefully my partner is doing that with me. I want them to see that and know why I was able to do it because of these skills that I have told them to put in my notes. We can do this. We have to do this. If we want ideals like continuity of care, we don't want our birth professionals exhausted. If we want a partnership model, then we as consumers need to get our shit together and become skilled to work through the activity of birthing our baby. Doesn't matter where we birth, doesn't matter who's present. It doesn't matter what our circumstances are, or our beliefs, or our choices, or lack of choices, or change of choices, or what happens to or around us at the birth. We get pregnant to have a baby, and we're doing the activity of birthing our baby. And every human activity is best done with skills. And we should elevate this infrequent, one-off, life-transforming activity that cannot be replayed the next day to a highly skilled activity in which we are self-learning skills and then using our skills. If we have that kind of a partnership model with any of our birth professionals, then they are going to see more and more of their families, their clients, using skills. They will get more enjoyment out of working with us. We will be able to negotiate our care better with them because of our behavior. They see and hear us. If we want to have informed consent and our choices met, then we have to behave as though we are in control and coping well. This makes common sense. If you have children and your children are being reasonable about something that is not what you would like them to do, and then their behavior when you give in to them is reasonable, and you can see that, then you feel good about that. If their behavior is unreasonable and their behavior, what you give to them is unreasonable, then you don't feel good and you feel nervous. Birth professionals are human beings. They feel the same way. When they are in a normal, when they are with low risk women, and they are assuming that everything is all right, they are still doing assessments, monitoring, and perhaps not as many procedures. However, if that low risk labor goes on and on and on, which is normal and natural, and the woman gets tired and fatigued and is losing the plot, and she still wants to keep going, it makes those human beings who are birth professionals feel unsettled because they know that those circumstances might lead to a problem, and problems might lead to a tragedy. So if we want to truly have an effective maternity system that delivers service to us, then we truly must grow a skilled birthing population for all births without exception through a concept that's easy to remember. And you already know how to repeat this after me. When you're pregnant, It's normal and natural to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills and then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing our babies. This is a no-brainer. This will change childbirth and the conversation for the positive, for everyone, just as we saw it begin to change in the 60s and the 70s with the first ever skills-based methods for childbirth. The only reason that that did not succeed was that the goals were focused on low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions, rather than skills focused on 100% of pregnant women who will give birth one way or another, and that the skills being used so that women feel in control throughout the activity of birthing their baby. That really needs to be the goal. So if you're a New Zealand midwife who's listening to this and is raging at the camera, understand that our trust has always supported your model. We just want to make it stronger. We want you not to be so tired. We want you to work with more skilled families. And if you're a New Zealand family listening to this, thinking, oh, they're just being dismissive of the midwifery model, you need to understand that our 50 years of experience with skilled families can show the benefits of having a strong partnership when midwives care enough to go to school for 4 years to give you continuity of care 24/7, give you a partnership model based on your choices. Give them something back. What's that? When you're pregnant, self-learn birth and birth coaching skills. Birthing better skills were developed by families and focus on how you prepare your body as well, which other methods don't necessarily do. And birth and birth coaching skills so that you work through the activity of birthing your baby. So that what your New Zealand midwifery partner sees are coping families who are working well through the activity of birthing their baby. Everybody benefits from this. So if we want continuity of care, our society needs to change the conversation. If we want a partnership model, we already have it. We have it with every care provider we use. We see it as a partnership. They don't have to. And we have to act as though it's a partner. Now, let me just tell you that birthing better families since the 70s, majority of them were medically high risk. And they wanted skills so that they could reduce or prevent risks from becoming a problem and certainly from becoming a tragedy. And they also wanted to work together as families. So they wanted something they could do at their home. But the commitment to behave, to cope, to manage, to work through, to handle, to stay on top of and feel in control during the activity of birthing their baby meant that the labor and delivery nurses in the United States, the obstetricians, negotiated with them better over the standards of care, over the assessments, monitoring procedures. Because if the high risks, through the assessments and monitoring, everything seemed fine and the woman was managing well, everybody relaxed, everybody calmed down. And when there was an indication something wasn't okay, the family continued to use the skills and they appreciated that there was medical care available to them. So everything calms down and everybody feels more engaged and more satisfied with the birth experience. I've talked long enough. See you again when I get to the next video in this series. See you later.